Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for being here with us in our breakout session for addressing cultural conflict in the workplace. We're sure you've had a great summit thus far, and certainly it will continue in that fashion. My name is Brian Kemji. I'm the Director of Development and Communications for the Urban League of Greater Madison, and it is my pleasure to announce our panelists, in particular our moderator, who is Ananda Murilli. She is unafraid and unapologetic in her commitment to and centering of racial justice from a global and intersectional space that evokes creativity and innovation in tackling deep-seated inequities. She is a native of Brazil and has a long history of working with communities in the U.S. and abroad. At age 14, she engaged in social justice movements advocating for children with multiple abilities, youth, and seniors experiencing poverty and homelessness. After moving to the U.S., Ananda became an educator and found her passion for facilitating learning spaces for individuals, groups, and organizations engaging in transformative work. Ananda's commitment to racial and gender justice led to her develop new frames for youth and women's leadership. As a skilled facilitator, Ananda has engaged with thousands of youth, women, and diverse professionals, building coalition and solidarity. She is a beautiful storyteller and a deep listener, a thoughtful, experienced practitioner who centers love and restorative principles in the work that she does. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for our moderator for this breakout session, Ananda. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was beautiful.
Did you write it?
No. This is the first time I actually heard somebody else also read it, so thank you so much. Let's give it up for Brian. He did a phenomenal job getting us warmed up. As a Brazilian, I should say bom dia. As a member of the Latinx community, buenos dias. And good morning for the rest of you. My pronouns are she, they. Anything said with love, I'm answering. I'm excited to be moderating this panel because there are people here, colleagues that I've known and friends that I've known for a long time. But I do have some disclaimers before we begin. This session aims to discuss the practice of addressing cultural conflict in the workplace. If you're looking for a comfortable session, this is not it. Oh, wow, applauses. I wasn't expecting that. I will say that, we will not be offended if you leave now or later. It's all good. Nobody left, so we're good. So for those of you that stayed and willingly stayed, we want to invite you to lean in to this place of discomfort as we hope to co-create, along with this amazing panelists, a space for learning, including a learning space for me. So I wanted to introduce our amazing speakers, our amazing panelists here. I'll begin with a dear, long friend, Naomi Takahashi. Naomi is the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at UW Health at the School of Medicine and Public Health. And I get a pleasure to long time standing working with Naomi. So my role in Nina Collective, we work with the department. Naomi is an experienced DEI practitioner and racial equity educator, and in her role, she supports DEI program expansion and the strategic development of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives across the academic medical center. Naomi is passionate about changing the structures and systems that perpetuate inequities in our community, stems from experiences growing up as a multiracial woman in Wisconsin, as well as from professional and personal experiences participating in a variety of workplace systems in Dane County. From more direct services role as a clinical social worker to lecturing within the UW's Madison School of Social Work to systems level roles facilitating organizational change within the private and public sector. She earned a BA in psychology at Wesleyan University, MSW at UW-Madison, and holds a clinical social work licensure. Please help me give a warm welcome to Naomi. Somebody that I really appreciated to get to know a little better, Jihan Bakiri, is the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at WPS Health Solutions. In her role, she leads the company's effort in making diversity, equity, and inclusion a part of our systems, behaviors, and how we work every day. She was she was named an In Business Madison 40 Under 40 in March 2022. Her background includes an extensive focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion at American Family Insurance and the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. She graduated with honors from Marquette University with a bachelor's in arts and international affairs, followed by earning a master's of science in international development from the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom with distinction. Bakiri is also a certified diversity executive and practitioner from the Institute for Diversity certification. She's multilingual, yay, and is fluent in Albanian and Turkish. Please help me give a warm welcome to Jihan. And finally, this woman is amazing. Angela Russell is the Chief Diversity Officer and is the Vice President of the CUNA Mutual Foundation at CUNA Mutual Group. In these roles, Angela provides a strategic enterprise-wide leadership to ensure that CUNA Mutual's commitment to DEIs is reflective in the workplace, community partnerships, and marketplace in our products, process, and services. In 2021, Angela was the recipient of the inaugural DEI Trailblazer Award from the African American Credit Union Coalition, and in 2018, she was named as one of the nation's most powerful diversity executives by Black Enterprise magazine. I had to say that very slowly, right? She's a very humble person because I did not know that happened. And I know Angela for a long time. Continue. Prior to joining CUNA Mutual, Angela worked in various roles in public health, including serving as a health equity coordinator for Public Health Madison-Dane County, and she was the community engagement lead for the National County Health Rankings and Roadmaps program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Population Health Institute. Angela Russell has also worked in a variety of roles in Wisconsin state government. She holds a master's in science in population health from the University of Wisconsin School of Madison in public health and a bachelor of science in biochemistry from Beloit College. In 2021, Angela was awarded an honorary doctorate of science degree from Beloit College. Let's give her a warm welcome, everyone. I'm in good company. I don't know, have you all noticed that? This panel is amazing. So let's begin our discussion by grounding on our theme, the theme of our panel, around cultural conflict. Culture is often used as a proxy to race and ethnicity. And we want to make explicit one of the most pervasive, harmful, and historical sources of cultural conflict in this country, called white supremacy culture. Have you heard of that? Have you heard of that? Yeah. Yes, thank you. Yes. So we'll begin, we'll open up this panel with a dear friend, Angela Russell. And Angela, tell us, how does white supremacy culture create and procreate a fertile ground for cultural conflict in the workplace?
That question makes me so uncomfortable. I'm joking. So I just want to ground us in what is white supremacy culture. So white supremacy culture is a system. It's not calling white folks white supremacists, right? So that gets conflated a lot. And I'm going to be really academic for just a second and read a definition that white supremacy culture is a widespread ideology baked into beliefs, values, and standards of being that values whiteness. I'm veering from the academic definition already, and teaches both overtly and covertly that whiteness holds value. Whiteness is value. Whiteness is the point, the center, and the norm. So if you think about our communities and our workplaces, lots of our workplace conflict as it relates to culture is framed on conflict with white supremacy culture. And I think when I first heard about this panel, I'm like, oh, they want this to be a nice little panel about talking about the little kind of conflict that comes up with maybe Black and Latinx folks or, between the races, but actually not naming what the pervasive cultural conflict is, which is bumping up against white supremacy culture. White supremacy culture, for example, and I'm just going to use Black as an example, teaches that Blackness does not hold value, is threatening and dangerous, as an example. Make sense? So, and there are some examples of how white supremacy culture shows up in workplaces. And I do want to add another caveat in terms of white supremacy culture. White supremacy culture, systematic manifestation of culture, isn't just for white folks, right? It's something that manifests everywhere. And if we haven't done our own internal work as folks of color, it will show up as us agreeing with white culture just to assimilate and move ahead in dominant spaces. So, themes or examples of white supremacy culture are binary thinking, right? It's either this or that. The sense of urgency, right to comfort for white folks in general. So I don't know if anyone has been to a diversity, quote unquote, diversity training where someone says, I'm uncomfortable, and it's like, okay, what do you want me to do about that? Discomfort is a sign of growth. We don't want to push people to their panic edge, but that discomfort can oftentimes be a sign of growth. This is probably going to be TMI, but I'm going to do it anyway. I started seeing a trainer, and yesterday I saw her, and I was whining because I always do, and I'm like, this is heavy. She's like, yeah, what's your point? This is uncomfortable. She's like, yeah, what's your point? Does it hurt? I'm like, no, it's just uncomfortable. She's like, that's where the growth is. So that's where our growth is too, in terms of all of this stuff. Power hoarding is another example. Perfectionism. Progress is always bigger and better, and fear of open conflict. I don't know if any of y'all see that show up in your workplaces sometimes. I'm assuming that's a yes, because that is pervasive. That is how a lot of cultural conflict happens when you try to increase, quote unquote, diversity, and it goes against the dominant culture of white supremacy. Did I answer your question?
Whoa. Did she answer?
I don't remember your question.
Oh, no. We got into the journey. Did you get a sample of how this panel is going to be like? I'm curious, Jehan and Naomi, is there anything else that you'd like to add in regards to this landscape that we're navigating, and now this sharp interest in addressing conflict in the workplace, when we know everything around us surrounds us in white supremacy culture?
All right, is that good? My voice kind of carries anyway, so I think what was really eye-opening for me, I think when we talk about the work we need to do as practitioners and internal work, and you talked about, Angela, assimilating. And for me, I think leading this work, the hardest part, one, I like to show up as authentically as I possibly can. It's very hard here in the United States and in Madison, Wisconsin, because I don't fit into a box, and it takes people a really long time, both people of color, I will say, and for the dominant white population, to just figure out, like, who are you, and, like, are you enough to be even talking about this? Like, your skin color is not I'm not sure even what to do with you. And so I find myself, like, that's being the most where the most discomfort occurs, because it's not just discomfort as like, I matter here and I want to tell this story. But once you get that courage to tell the story, that gloss look when people want a really quick answer to like, what are you? And I have to go into like centuries of history because that's what's formed my background. And I imagine that people actually really want to know. And when I see that gloss look, I'm like, oh, this isn't really what you're looking for. I think that's like the most, for me, when we talk about how we lead the work and how we can help with educating folks, it's like being vulnerable, being transparent, but also trying to protect myself too, because it's important. We did say this was going to be an uncomfortable panel maybe for folks, but I also need to preserve myself and my being, and I don't want to, sacrifice that for someone else's learning. So how are they able to meet me in the middle? Do they really want to learn? Do they want to know more? And working through conflict is challenging because I looked through definitions of conflict. Definitions of conflict have very negative connotations here in the United States. It's always bad. And so anytime you kind of start to have what I think is more like that healthy debate part of conflict, and we even talked about this in our preparation, once we start to get to that point, that's where the true learning can happen. But if you've got folks that are maybe on the other side that are even struggling to get there, that's where I find the hardest to not assimilate and to push myself even to stay in that discomfort for that purpose of learning.
Wow, great. Thank you, Jihan. Naomi, what else would you add?
It is heavy. Can you hear me okay? So the only thing, I really appreciate, Angela, Jihan, your comments. The only other thing I would add is that we're all in this water, right? So it's not something that anybody is not touching or experiencing or actually engaging in. And so when we talk about white supremacy culture, we are swimming in this sort of dirty water together. And so what that means is that every single person has a role in really identifying how it shows up in you. So Jihan talked about that sort of self-awareness piece and the self-work and the growth that we all have to engage in, and then do something about it. So I think, one of the terms that we use a lot at UW Health now is anti-racism, and it's a term that I think is maybe a little bit newer since the murder of George Floyd has kind of taken off in a way, and it really does have to speak to the action that we need everybody to be engaging in. This isn't something that just the DEI practitioners do. This is something that everybody needs to be engaging in and figuring out what is my role and how can I really push, because a part of it is to push against white supremacy culture is pushing against something that feels really normal and easy. So I think about healthcare specifically, and that one of the kind of characteristics that shows up in healthcare is a sense of urgency. So everything is urgent. Everything needs to be done now. Everything is last minute. Can you get this to me tomorrow? Can you look through this and in the next 24 hours? I need it right away. And so it's really hard to engage in sort of pushing against that, especially in healthcare, lives are at stake, right? So we know that people's lives, patients' lives, families' lives are being impacted on a daily basis in these negative ways. And so how do we slow ourselves down so that we're not engaging in ways that are actually perpetuating that norm, that white norm and the status quo, as well as actually probably continuing to perpetuate the biases, right, that we all know we have and it exists within our system. So from the healthcare lens, I see that one showing up really frequently. I see it in myself, where I actually have to pause and take a breath and realize you don't have to do meetings back to back without a potty break, basically. And that this is something that we really need to figure out a new way of doing and being. Otherwise, the conflict is going to become negative, right, versus productive, and in a way that we can actually engage with each other.
Great. Thank you so much. John, I'm going to come to you. You spoke to how when folks are trying to understand who you are, like there's I thought it was very poetic the way you answer, and true, around the centuries of history, right? And often like not what people want to know. In particular, when we're talking about white supremacy culture, very transactional. No, tell me what I need to know in order for us to navigate. Right. Tell us a little bit more about like how our individual and or collective upbringing inform how we understand and navigate conflict, in particular conflict in the workplace? And what is our responsibility as leaders, I'm talking about all of us, and organizations?
Sorry, I write to process too. So. Okay, so my individual upbringing, I laughed when you were saying that, because I've had a couple people that have, in response, have said, I just don't have time for your seminar right now, but I'd love to. And I was like, wow, I didn't know I was giving a seminar, but I'd love to. I appreciate the perspective. So I think for me personally, my individual upbringing, it has had, because of where my family is from, so we're from the former Yugoslavia. My family is Albanian and Turkish, in now what is called North Macedonia. I have to check myself. It's the name of the country has changed a few times since I've been born. And I think what that means for what's helped me is that I've not this desire to fit everyone into a box, and being able to navigate in the gray and to understand that the human experience isn't just one nicely neat box that's on a piece of paper that defines, and that continues to change the definition of who falls within this box. So for me, my individual upbringing has informed that, and the ability to be comfortable. What I see in a lot of the dominant population is that I categorize it, so this is me with my own categorization, but it feels like there's a sense of fear in something that isn't neatly packaged. And I think that that fear might be manifested as, I think it is that kind of not understanding difference, not needing to, because most of people around them have kind of experienced life, experienced the world very similarly. And so I think your individual upbringing really informs how you show up later on in life. So for me, it's helped me really navigate that gray and to understand that there are multiple facets of an identity in a human being, and it helps me with, as you mentioned, that importance of pause. I think that what I come across, and when you ask about what leaders can do, is really in the workplace, getting people to pause, to ask questions, and to be okay with maybe an answer that you don't expect, a quick answer. How do you help people understand that when you're at work, not everyone's going to have a similar experience to you, and that's okay. We don't need to fit, you don't need to try to fit me or anyone else that doesn't fit into your box nicely, try to make it fit, right? Like, it's like, I need to understand how this person relate them to me. What if we just paused and start to say that I don't understand this, and that's okay. There's beauty in that too. There's beauty in us learning from each other rather than trying to make it so similar. And I know that sometimes goes against human nature even. Like, we do as human beings gravitate towards things that are similar to us to understand. But how can you pause in the moment and find that beauty, I guess, in the difference?
Thank you so much.
That's too utopia, but that's my dream.
I'm all for utopia. Thank you so much for modeling for us aspects of how white supremacy has shown up for you individually and also in a workplace. And as an educator, I love the permission to not know something, right? Which is also extremely antagonic to white supremacy culture. We all need to know everything that's happening now and in the next 30 days. And that's not possible, in particular when we are navigating very diverse places.
Sorry, I just have to say one thing that comes up in personal life that I think of is this need, you said in 30 days, this need to plan ahead is very different than the cultural upbringing that I had, and I'm constantly at odds because I know in the professional world I need to have things planned out, whereas I find that really increases anxiety. And even when I work with folks that, friends, I've kind of had to model with my friends that aren't that aren't more my white friends, that are like trying to figure out, I don't know what time I'm going to want to have you come over in October. Can we see how we feel? And my mother always used to say to me, if we are healthy and well, we will talk about it that day. And I was like, okay, thank you. And I feel like that, it's just like anxiety ridden to try to navigate within that space.
And the moderator is having like a warm feeling right now. Because I can't, even though we grew up in like different parts of the world, I can relate to a lot of the things that you're saying. I'd love to hear, Naomi and Angela, what else came up for either of you?
This isn't related to upbringing because, I don't want to talk about that right now. But what's been coming up for me just listening to this conversation and reflecting is that how elements of white supremacy culture are embedded into the practice of DEI. And my fear and my own kind of work on how I should not use the knowledge of white supremacy culture as a weapon. And so if you go to the white supremacy culture website, there's all of this caution on do not use this information as a weapon. And that's work that I need to do, but it's that using it as a weapon is a manifestation of white supremacy culture in the practice of becoming an anti-racist and a more just society, because it reinforces that either or thinking. And what ends up happening is this really harmful cancel culture. And I don't know if y'all have read the book We Will Not Cancel Us by Adrienne Marie Brown, but that's literally how we've all been infected by this pervasiveness of there has to be one right person, there has to be one right answer, as opposed to appreciating the differences and that notion of co-creating. And what keeps coming back up for me during this conversation and in the practice is that where is the space for a sense of radical love in the work of DEI? Because we're not going to get to where we want to be unless we have a sense of radical love for us that's not defined by white dominance, and a radical love for each other that's not defined by white dominance. So that's what's coming up.
Okay, radical love. Let me get into that, and then I want to hear from Naomi. What is radical love in conflict?
Are you asking me to define that from a white supremacy perspective?
Well, maybe more practical would be how does radical love shows up in the dynamic of conflict? And as someone that's a practitioner in holding conflict does not always means resolution, right?
Oh, good God, no.
So what is radical love for self and for others in the midst of conflict?
So the first answer that comes up is that it's a practice. It's not a thing. It's not a thing. It's a continual practice. One of the things that I said years ago to another colleague of mine that's a DEI practitioner is that if you're a DEI practitioner, you have to have a therapist in order to do this work effectively. And I deeply, deeply believe that. Because if I cannot figure out a way to love myself, there's no way that this work will be, I will embody the work of love in the work of DEI. So radical love means grace. Grace that we're not all at the same place. Grace for myself that what I think today on DEI is going to be different than what I think in 3 to 5 years from DEI. And it's different than what I thought 3 to 5 years ago. That grace and space for learning, that grace and space for forgiveness, knowing that emotions are going to come up, knowing that you're going to get triggered. I learned this from my therapist just last week. She's like, when you feel really judgy? And I'm like, yeah. What about it? Yeah. She's like, you're triggered. I'm like, oh, okay. She's like, so when you start to feel that judgy feeling, slow down and identify what's being triggered. And that takes practice. That takes love of myself and knowing that my humanity is connected to every other person in this room and in this world. And it's a practice.
I absolutely appreciate bringing love to the conversation around conflict. Because we can't do anything without those two hand in hand.
I mean, honestly, and I think I learned the most about that through having a preteen and a teenager, right?
They do teach us a lot.
I love you dearly, and I do not know what the hell you were talking about right now. If you've had teenagers or preteens, it's like, oh my God, I love you so much, and we can have this conflict based in love. We're not going to agree, and that's okay.
Thank
Or
you.
a toddler in my.
Oh, yeah,
Yes.
right.
So Naomi, let's get to you because a lot has emerged since the question, and pick up however you're navigating the conversation.
Well, when Angela was talking about getting judgy, I was thinking about like the moment where you get an email and you're just like, oh yeah, they said the thing, and you're ready to like respond and judge and put it out there, and then that's when you take a step away from your virtual desk and walk around the block or do something like that. Because I do think that really for this work to be able to thrive and grow, that love and that shared humanity has to be the approach. So I feel like I talk about this every single day, and this actually came up recently at work because people are wondering why we center race when we talk about conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this has come up in many different audiences at UW Health, in my personal life. What about other identities? Aren't those important? And absolutely. But the reason that we center race is because of that shared humanity piece. If we cannot kind of understand where systemic racism lives within our organizations, within our community, within ourselves, and then figure out where it lives interpersonally within us, then we're not going to be able to sort of solve other problems that we might have related to other identities, because race is one of the hardest, most divisive topics that we have in this world. And I think that feels like a hard place to start, but it is the only place to start, because I think we've tried the other things. We've tried to sort of create a way of doing things without centering race, and that's why when we talk about centering race, we do center white supremacy culture, and sort of what does it look like for us to dismantle this in a way where we're centering humanity and the understanding where this shows up in us. And I think that there's that check step, and as a previous therapist in my previous life, I would say yes, therapy is really, really important, because that check step, if you don't have it, maybe that's another sort of colleague that you have that's close to you, maybe that's a family member, of being able to take a step back and saying, how is it showing up in me, so that I'm not burning myself out, because I think especially in this DEI work, it can be exhausting, it can be really, really hard to sort of just kind of bear witness. I think that's a part of it, to some of the suffering that folks within our organization experience every single day, day in and day out, right? And so I think when I think about radical love, I think about that centering of self, just like Angela was talking about, of how important it is to be able to sort of hold space for yourself so that you don't get lost, because then you're going to be responding to those emails, at 1 o'clock in the morning, like jittery off of caffeine, right? Like when you're not supposed to be doing it, versus like taking a step back and waiting. And again, that's that sort of sense of urgency showing up of like, I have to respond. This person's gonna like keep believing the thing if I don't respond now, versus, really taking care of yourself and seeing that as critically important. And I say that to all of you was something that I need to continue to practice myself.
Can I just riff off of that a little bit, and that need to respond to that person who is like, you want to be judgy with? Not you, me. Sometimes I'm not the right person to respond, and that's that humility to know when I'm the right person and when I'm not the right person is also a thing that I've learned over time. And Margaret Wheatley, a great writer on leadership, she has this article called Leading in a Time of Uncertainty, and it talks about host leadership versus hero leadership. There's a tendency in the DEI space to want to be the hero to solve all the problems, right? But that's not creating space for co-creation to happen and being a host. And being a hero, again, is that manifestation of white supremacy culture. So there are times where I just feel overwhelmed at my job, like there's too much going on, and I'll check in with a friend, and they will ask me, are you trying to be the hero? And I'm like, well, damn, did you have to go there? You did, and thank you. And that's a good check, because it doesn't always have to be you. So figuring out who among your colleagues, and your colleagues don't even need to be DEI practitioners, but they could be someone who will be heard a little bit differently based on gender, race, a whole variety, tenure at the company, a whole variety of things, and knowing when to bring in other folks, and knowing that that's okay. That's not a character flaw. It's really a manifestation of how we have to co-create this space together.
Wow, so much brilliance. And I love how we are weaving in conflict and juxtaposed to white supremacy culture and, default culture currently, and how it's everywhere. So when we talk about conflict, it's not something that's happening over here, right, or over there, or just in that one email. But I do wanted to pick up the email because I did go there. I was like thinking about all the draft emails that never left my inbox in order for me to not get fired. But I wanted to bring to this, and Angela, you brought that too, around the collective care. So we're going to do like a lightning round. What are one or two things that sustain you all in the space of conflict? What is one or two things that sustain you in the space of conflict? And I really hope that you all are answering that for yourselves too. Who's ready to get us kick off here?
I'll start, and it's just off the top of my head, is my relationship with the person. Generally, I have great admiration, generally, underscore that, underline, bold it. Generally, I have great respect and admiration and deep love for the person that I'm in conflict with. And in order to preserve that relationship, I take a step back. I have to take a step back and understand, what am I doing to contribute to this conflict? Is this conflict a necessarily bad thing? I really liked kind of your framing, Jihan, about that conflict doesn't need to be negative, and kind of curious about what can grow from that particular thing that's happening. I use seed metaphors a lot, or I'll use an egg metaphor that'll work too. Like for a seed cannot grow into its full potential unless it cracks open, right? Conflict is an opportunity to crack open and kind of start something new. So getting curious about where it could lead.
Thank you. Jihan, what are some of the 1-2 things that sustain you in the space of conflict?
So it's not it's not anything really bold, but it really works for me, is breathing really slowly. I tend to I'm a little bit more of an anxious person. You can probably tell maybe from my voice. So I slowing down my breathing really helps for me. And I think when I'm in a good spot where I actually am having a relationship, like I'm having conflict with someone that I really care about, I think it's easier for me to slow down a little bit. That I have a more of a familiar, I guess, relationship. Not that I don't care about some people, but that I actually have something invested, and I really. That one I feel like I can slow myself down more, but to be really fully transparent, where I struggle the most is when it's someone that has views that are very difficult for me to understand because they feel so against shared humanity. That's where I really struggle to slow down and to pause. And so I try to when I'm pausing as hard as I can, it feels like it takes a lot longer to go through my breathing exercises and really slow down my breathing, is try to make the other person in front of me as human as I possibly can and start to think through different aspects of their own experience to try to build that humanity if we haven't had it prior to whatever sort of conflict we might be in. And then my favorite, which takes a little bit more time, but while I'm going through to recharge, is to be able to go back to the Balkans when I can. And it's like something in the air. I wasn't born there. I spent a lot of time there, but something in the air in those mountains and like the smell. If I get the smell, it's usually like a mix of burning wood and roasted red peppers. It's a very distinct smell. And that smell really calms me down. So sometimes at home, when we're having a tough time, my mom will roast red peppers for us to slow down. So while I don't have children, but my mother is amazing and also tests me in very different ways. So she is one person that helps keep me grounded.
Thank you. Naomi, what's sustaining you?
I think knowing myself and what triggers me is one of the first things. So doing that kind of unearthing and really sitting with it. So even reminding myself of moments where I was significantly triggered. For me, it's when I'm being sort of told or blamed for something that I didn't feel like I was responsible for. So that's one of my really big ones. And so just being able to sort of sit with that and feel it and then kind of see what comes up in my body. So even sort of that as a practice. The other thing is, I think if I'm in conflict with somebody is, I don't know if anybody else does this, but I'm a real systems person, so I like literally pull back in my head. So it's sort of like this moment where I'm trying to like be out of body a little bit, where I'm like thinking about what does it look like from up here? What else is playing a role in what's going on here? What is my goal, right? What is my North Star here? What am I trying to achieve through this conversation? If I behave in a certain way, am I going to be able to achieve that? So that's another way that I sort of manage the trigger, is sort of almost pulling back a little bit and remembering, okay, this is like a small piece. This is a small seed to this larger forest, right? So am I really working to sort of plant and grow this? Or am I just trying to like get the last word? What is sort of the space that I'm taking up, and being able to really pull myself back and see potential scenarios almost, right? So it's like a kind of like a mind game that I play. So I would say that's the other piece, is just always sort of pulling back. I do that a couple times a day, is sort of like when I'm getting into the weeds on something really kind of small or minute, but it's really frustrating and taxing, or it was a conversation that maybe didn't go as well as I thought it should have, or there's been an ask or a request that's sort of like really irritating. Then I do that pulling back, and that's a way that I manage even my response in the moment too. And I think that pause, right? Is it Viktor Frankl who says like there's space between sort of like the stimulus of what happens and then your response is engaging in that pause. So really pausing myself before I go.
The other thing that helps me, because I was just thinking about it, is my community. Sometimes I don't know when I'm about to be in conflict with someone. That sounds weird, but or I'm in conflict with someone, and someone will send me a text during a meeting saying, "Fix your face." I'm like, "What? What's wrong with my face?" Everything just shows. You've probably been in those meetings with me too. Like everything is just showing. I'm like, oh, okay. So that's a reminder to me that stuff is happening up here before I even realize it. And that's also a reminder to me to pay attention to the nonverbals that other folks are, what folks are communicating nonverbally as well. But I rely on people to tell me to fix my face a lot.
All right, I'm gonna bring this question. I was off script a little bit. I'm gonna back on script on something we heard, for those of you that got here earlier, that we heard earlier this morning around diversifying the workforce. In particular, Wisconsin, Madison. Organizations across the country, and of course here, are increasingly diversifying the workforce and often dismissing the organizational culture that's needed to support, to retain Black, Indigenous, and people of color. What is, and this question is start with you, Naomi. What does the proactive the proactive work looks like, and then the ongoing to maintain that transformation that is needed in the workplace?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like it's thinking about all the systems at play, right? So it's like the minute a BIPOC employee applies for a job, all through, I think they call it in HR, the employee life cycle, right? So it's the minute they apply, they interview, they're onboarded, first 90 days, and then when they leave and they exit, right? And knowing the why, and then what's offered in between in terms of the support. I think what I hear a lot is folks hiring a DEI person and saying, okay, now bring in a bunch of folks, specifically BIPOC folks, and then we'll say we did the thing and we'll check the box and we'll move on. And a lot of, I think, again, what is not being paid close enough attention to is that folks in the community talk. So when you put an application out there and you want to recruit a diverse pool, and then you come back, or a recruiter comes to us and says, we're just not getting the applicants, they're just not out there, it's because people are talking about what it's like to work in your organization. So I think it has to be happening at the same time, right? The work has to be happening internally. People actually have to be walking the walk, whether or not they say they are. It actually has to be showing up in the way that people are experiencing the organization, because folks are going to go and tell their family and their friends, this is what it's like to work here. And then on top of that, you have to have the infrastructure, the support, the resources to be able to sustain those employees. And really, I think centering the folks that we know have the most turnover. You know, one of the metrics that we really are focused on at UW Health is decreasing the turnover between our BIPOC employees and their burnout and turnover versus our white employees. And we have a significant disparity when you think about the turnover rates there. So really thinking about what are we doing purposefully where we're centering race in terms of that retention piece. So making sure that folks have access to those resources at UW Health, its employee resource groups. I think there's opportunity for more mentorship and support, especially in a really taxing, overwhelming work environment, right? We all know that everyone is sort of being pulled in all these different directions because of the pandemic, so making sure people have their resources. That during the onboarding process, people are given sort of and centered with the resources and the tools they need to be successful. So I think about even, you know, not just having a DEI session and saying this is important, but what does it look like in policy and practice and process for people to be supported or to be able to elevate concerns around microaggressions or harm that people are experiencing in the workplace. So something that I think is actually really wonderful that our team does at UW Health is that we have an employee on our team who actually supports specifically our BIPOC and LGBTQ plus employees who are experiencing, whether that be kind of burnout generally, conflict in the workplace, whether that be with a leader or somebody else, microaggressions, discrimination, a gender transition, et cetera. There's a lot of reasons why folks come to us, but really being able to have a supportive check-in with somebody who kind of understands, doesn't question or ask why you're feeling this way, or also assume that they know what's best for you. And I think that creates the space of opportunity for really being able to ask the question, what else do you need, right? And I think that's something that leaders especially are not trained in being able to do. So I think as leaders, it's really critical to be trained up on sort of what does it look like to really support, rather than create transactional relationships with your employees, but really create a supportive, transformational relationship around that success and really centering that success and that development. So, you know, how do we make sure that employees have that space to process what's going to keep me here, what's going to make me leave, right? I don't think we prioritize, I think HR calls it stay interviews, right? So we don't prioritize this opportunity to say what's going to keep you here, what's going to make you stay, what's keeping you here now, you know, what can we continue to do versus making assumptions about what people want. So I think, I mean, that's very long-winded just to say that there's a lot of layers to it, and I think it's really thinking about the systems that are impacting employees when they come in, so even the interview process, the recruitment process, and then also sort of the retention space, so the processes that we have in place to support those employees. Are we mitigating for biases in terms of who's burning out, who's not feeling welcome? Are we making sure that we're creating opportunity for people to voice those concerns, and what does that look like? I think all of those things can play a role in that retention piece. And I have to put a plug in for our employee resource groups. If you don't have them, they're really a beautiful way for folks to come together with a shared affinity, to be able to share space and connect across large organizations that are predominantly white. We have 4 race-specific employee resource groups, and then we have a couple of others that are specific to gender, sexual orientation, as well as a military service membership. But, you know, there's a lot of opportunity there, I think, in creating that retention opportunity and structure too.
Naomi, I appreciate you sharing some key foundational work around the awareness of the organization, right? You need to know what are some of the things that you're doing really well. You're doing really well in retaining, recruiting, hiring, and retaining white folks. If you're working in an organization that's, 12, 15% staff of color, and they're the same staff of color or different staff of color, they've just been rotating, you're doing really well in retaining white staff. If you have being able to, if you call like your organizational culture nice, a good place to work, and you have kept the conflict siloed, you know that that's the culture of how you handle conflict. So that awareness piece is extremely important. I want to open up to Jihan and to Angela to talk a little bit more about this proactive work in a context, in particular around the awareness of organization. Briefly, I wanted to, there's some folks with questions in the audience. And if you don't mind just coming over here to the mic. Go ahead. Please don't. You're Oh, sorry, I could not hear. We're going to be doing what? Oh, I'm so sorry. I should have announced that earlier. Dwayne was not going to be able to be here with us today. So I'm sorry about that. Thank you for reminding me. Jihan and Angela, leaning into this.
Yeah, so yes, I agree. To pick up on what Naomi said, ERGs and affinity groups are really, really helpful. What's also helpful is to provide funding for those ERGs as well, so they're not just, it's not just an extra thing, and for your ERG leaders to have that baked into their job description as well. Lots of times our ERG leaders feel like they don't have the support of the manager to do the ERG leadership, so that's another important thing. Something that's not necessarily talked about a lot in the kind of DEI best practice world, which I hate that phrase, is a notion of unwritten rules. Every organization has unwritten rules of success. So when I first started at CUNA Mutual Group, I did a bunch of informational interviews, like 20 to 30 people, and I would ask, what does it look like to succeed here at CUNA Mutual Group? And that's where I learned the unwritten rules of success at CUNA Mutual Group. And the most consistent thing I heard was, you have to become CUNA Mutualized. And I'm like, my title says inclusion. That sounds like assimilation. But thank you. That's helpful for me to know what I'm walking into. But helping new folks understand what those unwritten rules of success are, because every organization has them. We've done exercises with different teams in the organization to say, what are the unwritten rules on your team, and then communicate those. And actually, what unwritten rules aren't healthy? What do we just need to get rid of? What do we need to change? So that's been helpful. Policies and practices, like Naomi said, is also good. Also paying attention to where your BIPOC employees are. So I'll give an example for CUNA Mutual Group. We've got a lot of Black and Latinx folks in our call centers. Call centers historically everywhere have really, really high turnover rates. So if most of your BIPOC employees are in call centers, you're going to have a high turnover rate. And what does career laddering look like in your organization? What does career mobility look like? Because when you have folks go up the career ladder, there's more opportunity for retention. The other thing that we're learning about is the definition of family and how the definition of family impacts our HR benefits. So, for example, if you have a bereavement policy that's only 3 to 5 days, that's not going to be enough for most folks. So what is the definition of family, and how can you make that more inclusive over time? Those are just a couple of examples. The other thing that really, I think, I give our leaders a lot of credit is that our leaders at CUNA Mutual embody this notion of confident humility, confident that we're on the right path with diversity, but humble enough to say, we don't know all the things and we need to keep going on this together. And it's kind of a steadfastness, confident humility to say, we got to learn this together, and that's really helpful.
Thank you.
Okay, so for me, being at WPS, they're very new in their journey. So it looks a little bit different. They really I started working there in early 2021, and that's really when they started working on diversity, equity, inclusion in a more formal fashion. They had great, I would say, like glimmers of work across things that had focused on employee experience, around inclusion, but really in earnest. And I think it was you, Ananda, that said awareness. And I think what I see now is that they're very excited. We want to move forward, we want to leapfrog, and we want to just plow through and get ahead. We want to do all the good things. We want to say all the good things. And sometimes when our data tells us that we still have some work to do, I feel like leadership, we struggle a little bit. And we want to find a reason why, instead of just sitting and saying, you know what, this is where we're at right now, and this is what we need to do to focus and to move forward. So I think for us right now is that continuing to do all the work, as you said, supporting employees through the employee life cycle, and we're working on just creating employee resource groups, so we're at that stage where we're still we're really, I would say, foundational. But what I worry about a little bit is that I think that everyone sees it as like a linear progression sometimes. Like we're on the up and up. Everything will be great. And it's like, we're going to take some steps back. The first year we didn't hear a lot from our employees when we would put things out, and that was concerning to me. I was like, this is not, I want to hear some voices. And now we're starting to see more and more employees kind of vocalize and talk about things that are, I guess, against our DEI efforts, and really feeling like things are being taken away from a lot of our employees are from the dominant culture, feeling like things are being taken away. Why do we need to highlight cultural heritage months? Why don't we have a white month? Why don't we have a heterosexual month? Why don't we have insert all these different things? And I think when I share with our senior leaders, they're like, that's okay, keep going. I'm like, we are going to keep going, but it's important to hear this too. This is where we're at also. Saying that this isn't a part, just saying it's a small percentage. It's still a part of our story. And so I think that awareness is really key, and it doesn't mean that we're not making progress and we can't let those voices overcome where we're going, but it's important to keep it in mind and be aware of where we actually are to help us get to where we want to be.
Yeah, and John, I actually wanted to follow up with this next question here, because you started talking a little bit about readiness and your organizational journey. So for folks that are here listening to this panel that want to either to begin or deepen their work and their practice in creating organizations where everyone belongs, right? This visioning that I love that you said that, Angela, too. It's like, there's a difference between wearing the t-shirt, organizational t-shirt, and actually feeling included in an organization. Jihan, what are some of the high levers organizations can engage in to expand their conflict resilience, right? The ability to hold change and transformation, both in an interpersonal way, individual way, but also, importantly, collective. What are some of those high levers that leaders and organizations can engage in to expand their conflict resilience?
So what I think about is, I don't know if it's a high lever necessarily, but I think there's a lot of power in modeling through vulnerability. Mm-hmm. So I see a lot of when our leaders give that permission to feel the discomfort, to embrace the change, I see that's kind of what helps us form that that environment to feel that it's okay. I think that psychological safety is really powerful in having a sense of belonging if you don't feel like you have the space to fail. And I don't mean failure in like your project and whatever it might be. Maybe today is it's just not your day. You whatever it might be, today is not your day, and you're just not able to bring your best self forward maybe. I've been in organizations before where that's labeled as like career crippling, career damaging. Whoa. And that had such an impact on me and my team for a lot longer than that day. And so I think if we're serious about belonging, is understanding that we are going to fail, whether it is on a product, whether it is in a meeting. Maybe I'm just, today I'm really talkative, but maybe tomorrow something happens and I'm not that talkative, and that's okay. That doesn't mean that I'm disengaged. It doesn't mean that all these other things, it just is. And to have that space from your leadership, whoever, if it's your direct supervisor, whoever it might be, to say, that's okay. One of my favorites is I had a boss and a mentor, and she used to say, it's okay, I'll love you tomorrow. And it was just so powerful for that moment to say, okay, today wasn't my day, and that's okay. And I think that's where it helped me feel, and other teammates feel, that it was okay for us to kind of fail forward and learn together.
It's coming up for you, Angela and Naomi.
I think another thing, especially leaders, can can take sort of ownership around is responding when there is actual harm that somebody is bringing to you. So if you're a leader, and that I think is an addition to that modeling, and if you're not sure why it's harmful, we always say don't ask the DEI people, don't ask the employee. Because I think that's another piece, is this sort of modeling vulnerability, but also in a way that's still supportive of the employee who's coming forward and trusting you with their story or their experience. And that we see a lot of the time leading to burnout and turnover, because people don't leave their jobs, they leave their leaders, right? So I think when you have a good leader, you have a good leader, and think about like what it is that makes them a good leader. And if you are a leader yourself, thinking about what those attributes are and how you can sort of emulate that. So not only sort of practicing like the I don't know what I don't know, and I'm here to figure it out with you, but also the I hear you, what would you like me to do next? I'm so sorry that happened to you, right? Versus I'm sure they didn't mean it, or it wasn't that big of a deal. Sort of that re-traumatization of any kind of racial trauma that's showing up in the workplace. So I would say that's another piece that leaders, especially as a tool, can just quickly engage in, is really sort of not re-aggressing somebody who's been harmed, but really sitting with, bearing witness, and then helping them and supporting them to be able to kind of take the next step, whatever that might look like. Whether that be just a space. And I think that's engagement with the mental health piece too, is that it impacts everyone's mental health, right? And being able to provide that space is also the responsibility of the leader. I think this pandemic has shown us that there needs to be that space, an opportunity to just be people, and have good days and have bad days, and everything in between. So that would be my suggestion as well.
Angela, how are you navigating this conversation? I know you're going to answer whatever it is that you want to answer. Why bother?
I also know that someone has a question in the audience.
Sorry. Okay.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I'll come to you.
I don't know what you're talking about, Ananda, but yes, I do. So a couple of things are coming up for me in terms of and we've all used this word, but re-emphasizing the word leader is really, there's something there for me about hierarchy that doesn't feel quite right. And I think it gets in our way, and we assume that if we're going to talk in a hierarchical sense, that each of our leaders don't have their own stories too. So everyone has a story, and white supremacy culture does impact conflict, but so do people's individual stories of their own conflict. One of the ERGs that we have at CUNY Mutual Group is domestic violence awareness. So we have part of our workforce that has experienced domestic violence, and that will absolutely impact how someone shows up in conflict. Because it does, and I'm not going to go into more of that, but it does. So every person has their story, and I also think that when you've got leaders of color, executives of color, their story is really tender. And how do we support their leadership while they're trying to hold it all down for the entire workforce of color, and that's not necessarily fair. So how do we, in our work of DEI, how do we not only hold our leaders accountable, whatever that means, but also hold their humanity intact? That's what's coming
I feel
up
like
for me.
you're tapping into part 2 of this panel, right? So many things.
I need a nap before that.
That sound good. No. Do you want to, from there, or do you want to use the mic?
I think I'll be okay. As a follow-on question to what Ida was saying, when conflict, more specifically, underlying conflict is harmful, has a negative impact or disruptive, what advice would you have to unearth or be able to bring that conflict to light? It hasn't already risen to the top. Right?
That was going to be my next question.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that question? Yeah, my follow-up question, and this is definitely my own stuff coming up. That word disruptive has such connotation to me. And can you define what you mean by disruptive? Disruptive for whom? And when we use that word disruptive, who is it benefiting and who is it burdening?
I was thinking collectively the team, or impacting what we as a group would be, what we want to accomplish.
Okay.
And I don't have a specific instance in mind. I'm not speaking to
Yeah.
my own experience, and just wondering how to, in a sense, nip it in the bud, or if you get to it before it comes to it.
Nip it in the bud. Why?
Well,
I'm challenging because the word disruptive, nip it in the bud, are clear examples of white supremacy culture that benefit white folks on a regular basis in organizations.
perhaps that's my, it sounds like.
Sorry.
No, I was brave enough to ask the question knowing it'd be challenging, and I'm okay with it.
I think.
When I see it as, when it is negative, or when it is bad for the collective, for the group.
Yeah, I think the part of what I've been hearing and learning from this panel is that conflict is happening all the time, everywhere, constantly, individually and collectively. Understanding what, like, that is part of the culture, like conflicts happening, and how your organization is navigating that from a place of learning and growth versus from a place of like, that needs to be nipped in the butt, that needs to go, this person should not be in this team and whatnot. Because the moment that you start doing that, that is no longer a place of belonging, right? There is already a place of exclusion, and knowing that that is part of your culture, organizational culture, is important. Because we all have historically excluded folks because of whatever XYZ things, right? As we're speaking to white supremacy culture. I think what I thought your question was going to be, which was going to be my next question to the panelists, was how do you actually shed the light in the culture, like how your organization is culturally navigating conflict? How do you shed the light in that? Angela.
You're like, fix your face, Angela. No, the reason I am shaking my head at that question is that's a very good question, and that's when that attempt to shed light, that's when employee relations and legal departments often get involved. So it's just like, well, damn, I don't know. And maybe it is shedding light on maybe not an HR conflict, but a kind of a interpersonal modeling how the conversation went and where it went sideways and how it got back on track. I don't know, but that's a tough one because I think a lot of organizations, particularly corporate, are challenged around transparency sometimes because of the perceived risk of liability.
Yeah, government too. We're not an exception. Anything else that's coming up for you all around shedding light in?
Yeah. So I'm just sitting here because I was like, I totally interpreted your answer, I think, differently than you were communicating. I thought you meant like, and maybe you did, shelter like actual, like employees if they are experiencing harm. Not like if it's disruptive to the group, but like if is that, okay, so that's why I was like, I just wanted to make sure that I was understanding, like how can you show up to, protect sounds, but like to preserve
support,
that.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's what I was just processing that externally, apparently, for a live audience. I think I kind of come back to, for me, it's the awareness piece and wanting to hear it. That's where I struggle the most, is like when something does bubble up. And I think for me, a very real example without oversharing is actually just the definitions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I've talked to Angela a little bit about this, is that we've got folks at our organization that I feel like kind of veer more towards wanting to focus on equality versus equity, and the words that are used for me seem to be very intentional to shy away from equity. But equity is now a core piece of our culture, and it's interesting when I do shed a light on this, and I talk to more senior leaders when we talk about this particular instance that is happening. It's like, well, you can't just shut people down for not agreeing with you. And that's where it's a difference for me, is that if we say that, equity is an opinion, that's where I get a little bit worried about, can we actually do this work? If you think equity is an opinion, then I kind of start to extend that logic and say, then if you think it's an opinion, then I am hearing you say that systemic oppression doesn't occur. racism, whatever it might be, you don't believe that this is a thing. If you don't believe that, then it's very challenging for us to really do the DEI work. It's not a matter of opinion. So constantly kind of centering that as, for me, that's the first awareness that we have to have together to say this is a part of our culture. This is our core. This is a part of who we are, and we take this to be true, not a belief, like opinion rather.
That's panel part 3. We have a question there, and then, okay, so the woman in the blue, and then the gentleman here, and then another person there. Yeah, go ahead. Hi.
Not to embarrass them.
Yeah.
More about today is that if you use the right phrasing, we can all learn together. But do you have any more examples of that phrasing that would not insult or hurt people, but give them to realize what they said was hurtful?
Somebody said a microaggression in the group. Previous ways was go talk to the person in private, do not create more conflict. Absolutely. And absolutely do not embarrass this person in public. How would you?
I mean, honestly, it depends on the situation. I think that this is another, if I can offer feedback, is it okay if I offer feedback? Okay. I think there's another example of binary thinking, as if there's one right way. It depends on the situation. It depends on, I'm going to be woo-woo for a second. It depends on the energy in the room. It depends on the time of day, because if it's at the end of the day, people are tired. It depends on the relationships that are in the space. Relationships in all of this work matter so much. So I'm not going to say here, give you a prescription on how to do this, because that's not what I do. You're going to have to feel it out, and that's where the growth can happen. And you may mess up, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And I think, I really appreciate that, because I do think there's so much gray in scenarios like that, because it depends on the microaggression or if it's a macroaggression, right? Yeah. And I think it's taking that pause and thinking about the strategy is okay. And again, like Angela said, you're going to mess up, and there is not, I get this question all the time, right? And I can say a thing, and you can try to repeat it, but it's not going to be the same in that moment.
That's right.
But I always think that, to me, transparency around that growth edge is always a good foot forward. So if you're not sure, be transparent about that.
Yeah.
Versus trying to do the thing perfect or the right way. And I think that's the way we're engaging folks, in that sort of like, I'm going to step into a little space of discomfort right now, and then opening it up, where we're recognizing people are going to feel uncomfortable, and that's actually going to be a part of this process, and that's the learning. And so to me, it's always being really transparent about this is what we're doing here, this is what we're trying to accomplish, and then putting that foot forward specifically. So.
And asking questions too, like, oh, and then this meeting I heard you say, I was curious on what you meant by that.
I've seen Angela do that often. And I also think about the impact on the bystanders if you don't say anything at that time or the following meeting. So let's do this, because we are in our time. Do you mind asking your question, and then you ask your question, and then we'll just turn to the panel.
So I would be remiss to not ask this strategic question, since I'm writing our DEI action plan, and it's due Friday.
Oh my God. Hurry up.
Just kidding there. I might ask for an extension, because we're not playing white supremacy terms. So,
Yes.
So I think our biggest opportunity is really deep engagement with our senior leadership to even understand the importance of this work rather than it being tokenized. But I think we have critical folks that are on our DEI team that are part of that team. What would you do as a strategy to engage senior leadership to adopt and start thinking about this? Because right now, they are the gatekeepers of access. I have zero access. We're at the beginning stages of our journey as well. So I love it. It's fun. I keep saying that. And I want the name of your therapist.
Yes. We all do. Okay, thank you. Great question. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, and this was already kind of spoken about in terms of defining diversity, equity, and inclusion,
All right, so I'm going to paraphrase, and you tell me if I'm not doing a good job. Strategy to engage seniors and leaders, in particular in this realm of gatekeeping, and what are some of the recommendations when everyone is agreeing with the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but do not agree on the way in which it gets lived out?
I can go. In terms of senior leadership buy-in, two approaches. Number one is demographics. Like, our demographics are changing, and if we are not kind of paying attention to that, we're not going to be able to accomplish our mission and as an organization, and demonstrating the demographics. And then the other part is having them tell their story. And relationships with individual leaders matters. And so if you can develop a relationship with each one of them and have them be able to tell their story to you on why it matters and why they're afraid of it, that goes a long way in terms of getting buy-in. So they don't feel like they are being quote unquote preached at or being the bad guy because they're a white dude, getting their buy-in and making sure that they feel like they belong to is huge. In terms of disagreement on the actual execution and the action plan, there's going to be disagreement. That's just the way that it's going to be. So figuring out, knowing that ahead of time and figuring out what are the small wins that you can get over time that leads up to something that you want bigger term, longer term. So I think about, for example, a CUNA Mutual group for Pride Month this year. We had a virtual drag show for our employees. That would have never happened, hell, two or 3 years ago, let alone 7 years ago. It took time to get to be able to do the things that we want to do as a DEI team. So knowing it just takes time, and take the wins and kind of learn from your failures along the way, but don't assume that you're going to get all agreement, because you're not.
Great. Jihan or Naomi?
I think spot on was exactly what about the strategic plan. But one thing with the senior leaders, and to piggyback off of what you're saying, Angela, and the relationships, I've also found that senior leaders feel very nervous that I'm like the police and I have it all right. And so the minute I show them that it's okay, we're going to make mistakes. It's not that they're like, I just don't want to say the wrong thing. And I say, but you're going to say the wrong thing. That's how we're going to learn. I've even seen them like physically shift down in their seat a little bit, and they're like, oh. And then I'll use examples from when I've messed up, and they're like, you make mistakes too? Yeah, I'm a human being. Of course I'm going to make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. That's how we learn together, and not being afraid to share a little bit of that connection really helps. It helps them for buy-in, but I think they need the psychological safety in that space too, to be able to fail forward too. They feel, I think there's this pressure to be like, you have to have it all figured out because you're in that role. There's sometimes talk about like, if you're in that senior leader role, you should know how to do this. And that's not setting someone up for success in learning at all.
Thank you. Naomi?
Nothing else to really add other than, it takes a while to grow the tree. So just keep knowing that you're planting seeds, and and you're pushing it forward, and keep planting the seeds, because something will continue to grow.
I wanted to share deep gratitude. I've learned so much from the three of you today. Thank you so much, Brian, for hosting us and for curating the space. Thank you all for participating in this amazing discussion. Let's give a round of applause to all of us. Those three amazing human beings are easily Googleable, so Google them, get in touch with them, and make sure to recommend and ask your questions, any other follow-ups. Thank you all.
In half an hour.
Thank you so much.